The grand chandelier reflected light over the polished wooden floor of the gala hall, casting tiny sparkles across the faces of the crowd. The room smelled faintly of perfume, expensive cologne, and the subtle scent of fresh flowers arranged in tall vases around the room. Waitresses moved gracefully among the guests, balancing trays stacked with glasses of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Each table was a small stage of its own, where conversations about investments, travel, and art floated through the air. Laughter rang out occasionally, soft and practiced, as if everyone here was performing in some unspoken social play. Among the staff, a young waitress moved quietly, weaving her way through the crowd with practiced ease. She carried a tray stacked with sparkling glasses, careful not to spill a drop. Her uniform was crisp, a simple black dress with a neat apron, but her shoes were soft and worn, hinting at the long hours she spent on her feet. She had learned early that being invisible in a room like this was often the safest way to get through a night without drawing attention. She did not need anyone's approval. She just needed to keep moving, keep serving, and keep herself out of the way. Tonight was no different. She had worked at upscale events before, but there was always something slightly intimidating about this particular crowd. They were the kind of people who could casually drop $100 bill without even noticing. The kind of people who spoke in references and anecdotes that seemed designed to remind others of how much they knew. And yet, she moved among them with calm focus, offering a polite smile here, a quiet "excuse me" there, and always keeping her hands steadied out as she approached a cluster of guests near the grand piano at the center of the hall. She overheard fragments of a conversation. "Do you think anyone here can actually play?" one man asked, sipping a glass of champagne. His voice was loud enough for several people nearby to hear, carrying just the right amount of arrogance to make the statement sting out another guest, laughed softly, tilting her head. "Well, we have the piano here, but I doubt anyone would dare." Her eyes flicked toward the waitress, who paused for a moment as she placed a tray on a nearby table. A third guest, clearly wanting to stir the moment, leaned forward with a smirk. "Why don't we ask her?" he said, gesturing toward the young waitress. "Maybe she can show us a thing or two." His tone was playful, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of doubt, the assumption that she was nothing more than a server, someone who belonged to the background of the evening rather than its spotlight. The room shifted subtly. Conversations faltered, attention diverted as more eyes turned toward her. Some faces were curious, some amused, some skeptical. The elite crowd that filled the hall had seen many things in their lives. But a moment like this, an interruption in their carefully curated evening, was unusual. The waitress froze for a heartbeat, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her. A flush crept across her cheeks, though she quickly swallowed it down. She had been through moments like this before, small challenges where the world seemed to expect her to shrink, to step back, to blend in. But something in her chest stirred, a flicker of courage she hadn't felt in years. This was a chance, however small, to show that she was more than the uniform she wore. Her mind wandered briefly, remembering the piano in her childhood home. She had not owned the piano in years, not since her family moved and life became too busy for music. But the memories remained vivid, the feel of the keys under her fingers, the scent of polished wood, the thrill of a melody rising from silence. She remembered sitting for hours, lost in the music, forgetting time and everything around her. She had dreamed of stages, of applause, of someone hearing her play and truly listening. But life had pulled her away from that dream, leaving her with a world of dishes, trays, and polite smiles instead. That the moment stretched. She felt the eyes on her, some skeptical, some amused, others silently curious. The man who had suggested she play raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "Well, are you going to?" The pressure was almost tangible, a weight she could feel on her shoulders. For a second, she considered laughing it off, walking away, letting the moment pass. She had done that countless times before, and then she made a choice. "I can try," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. It was not a boast, not an announcement, just a simple truth. The words were quiet, yet they carried across the room, drawing attention instantly. A ripple went through the crowd. Some laughed lightly, thinking it a joke. Others leaned forward, curious. A few exchanged glances, unsure if they were about to witness something remarkable or an awkward attempt. She set her tray down carefully, taking a deep breath as she approached the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet also freeing. She could feel her pulse in her temples, the quickening rhythm of anticipation. The polished keys gleamed under the soft lighting, and she ran her fingers over them absent-mindedly, feeling the coolness of the surface. For a moment, the room, the crowd, the opulent chandeliers all disappeared. All that remained was the piano and the music that lived in her memory. Guests whispered quietly among themselves. "Is she serious?" one asked. Another shook her head, hiding a smile behind her hand. A few men exchanged amused glances, confident that this would be a small, entertaining spectacle at best. They did not expect what was coming. She sat on the bench, adjusting her posture, letting her hands hover above the keys. The memory of her childhood lessons, of late nights practicing alone, of feeling every note vibrate through her body, returned with vivid clarity. She had not touched a piano in years, yet her fingers remembered. Music was not something she had lost. It had merely been waiting, quietly, for this moment to return. As she pressed the first note, the sound seemed to hang in the air, delicate and soft. It was not loud or showy, but it was confident, precise. The guests immediately noticed the difference between what they expected, a clumsy attempt, and what was happening. The waitress allowed herself a small smile, feeling the music settle in her bones, guiding her fingers, telling her where to go next. She began to play, slowly at first, letting the melody grow. Each note carried intention, each chord built upon the last. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the quiet power of someone reconnecting with a long-lost part of herself. Eyes widened around the room, whispers faded, and even the most skeptical guests found themselves drawn to the sound. It was not just music. It was a statement, a reminder that talent and passion cannot always be judged by appearances or by a uniform. The crowd leaned in, noticing details they might have overlooked before, the subtle expression on her face, the way her fingers danced effortlessly across the keys, the emotion that seemed to rise and fall with every note. Some guests held their breath, unsure whether to applaud, afraid of breaking the spell. Others exchanged astonished glances, unable to hide their surprise. The waitress played on, lost in the music, unaware of the effect she had on the room. It was a moment suspended in time. The elite, the wealthy, the powerful, all of them silent, watching a young waitress transform into something entirely different through the power of her music. The contrast was striking. Here was someone they had assumed to be ordinary, yet she was commanding attention in a way that few could. Her music told a story they did not expect, one of quiet confidence, hidden talent, and a lifetime of untold dedication. The first part of her performance ended with a soft, lingering note. She lifted her hands slowly, letting the sound fade naturally. The room was still for a heartbeat, suspended between expectation and reality. Then, slowly, the first clap came tentative, cautious. It was quickly followed by another, and then another, until the applause grew louder, warmer, more genuine. Some guests even stood, caught up in the moment, unable to contain their admiration. The man who had suggested she play earlier looked at her in astonishment. There was no trace of mockery on his face now, only genuine surprise and respect. Others who had doubted her exchanged sheepish smiles, realizing they had underestimated her completely. The whispers that had floated across the room before questions, jokes, doubts were gone, replaced by a single, undeniable truth. She had commanded the room with her talent, her presence, and her courage. She rose from the bench, breathing slightly heavier than before, not from exertion, but from the rush of emotion. A small smile played on her lips, tinged with disbelief at the reaction she had provoked. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel pride, a feeling she had tucked away for years. She had stepped into the spotlight, not for recognition or reward, but because she could, and because the music demanded it. As she returned to her tray, ready to continue her duties, she caught the eye of a few guests who nodded in silent acknowledgement. Some offered brief compliments, hesitant but sincere. Others simply watched, still mesmerized by the unexpected display of skill. She smiled politely, accepting the recognition quietly, letting it settle around her like a gentle warmth. That night, the gala continued, yet nothing felt quite the same. Conversations resumed, laughter returned, but the energy in the room had shifted. The young waitress had left an impression that would linger long after the event ended, a reminder that talent can appear in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the quietest people have the most extraordinary voice. The gala continued around her, the soft hum of conversation mixing with the occasional clink of glasses. The young waitress moved from table to table, placing plates of delicate appetizers with care, refilling drinks, and exchanging polite smiles. But beneath her practiced exterior, her mind was still swirling with what had just happened. She could still feel the echo of the notes under her fingers, the subtle thrill of commanding attention in a room filled with people who had assumed she belonged only in the background. She paused for a moment near the far side of the hall, leaning against the edge of a table as she exhaled slowly. Her heart was still racing, not from fear, but from a strange, exhilarating sense of possibility. The applause, the surprise, the genuine acknowledgement, it was all new to her, yet it felt oddly familiar. Music had always been a part of her, even when life had pulled her away from it. For a few moments, she allowed herself to remember the quiet hours at home, the late nights spent practicing scales, the songs that had poured from her fingertips when no one was watching. She shook her head slightly, trying to focus on her work, but it was difficult. The guests were talking, laughing, and enjoying themselves, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The elite crowd that had watched her had expectations, assumptions, and a kind of practiced arrogance. Yet she had challenged those assumptions, even if only for a moment. She could still feel the weight of their stares, the mix of doubt and curiosity in their eyes. As she moved toward another table, she overheard fragments of conversation that made her pause. "Did you see that?" a woman whispered to her companion. "She actually played beautifully. I never expected it." The companion nodded, eyes wide. "It was incredible. Where did she learn to play like that?" The waitress continued her route, quietly listening, a small smile playing at her lips. The murmurs of astonishment followed her like shadows, each one reinforcing the sense that she had made an impression that would not be forgotten easily. She had stepped into the spotlight, even briefly, and shown that appearances could be deceiving. The confidence she felt was subtle but growing, a quiet ember in the core of her being. Her thoughts drifted to the man who had first asked her to play. She remembered his smirk, the casual way he had assumed she would refuse or fail. She had seen that expression countless times before, in other contexts, in other people, an assumption that someone's place was in the background, their potential invisible. Yet she had quietly proven him wrong. And that realization made her pulse quicken with a mix of satisfaction and determination. A few guests approached her later, offering compliments and even small apologies for underestimating her. "I didn't think you would be able to play," one man admitted quietly, leaning on his cane. "But that was extraordinary." She nodded politely, accepting the praise without arrogance, letting it wash over her without becoming the focus of her identity. Her life had taught her humility, and she carried it naturally. Even in moments of unexpected recognition. As the evening continued, the young waitress began to notice subtle changes in the way guests interacted with her. Where before some had barely noticed her presence, now their eyes lingered slightly longer. Some smiled, perhaps remembering the brief moment of astonishment she had caused. Others whispered to one another, clearly intrigued by the story unfolding in front of them. She moved among the tables with the same careful grace as before, yet there was a quiet shift in her posture, a sense of newfound authority in the way she carried herself. During a lull between rounds, she paused near the grand piano again. The keys gleamed under the soft lights, calling to her in a way that felt irresistible. She allowed herself a few quiet moments, resting her hands lightly on the polished surface. The memories came rushing back, hours spent alone in a small room, learning, practicing, discovering the subtle power of music. She remembered the joy of creating something entirely her own, the feeling of a melody rising from silence and taking shape under her fingertips. For a few minutes, she let herself relive that joy, the kind of joy that comes only when the world fades away and the music becomes everything. A few guests passed by, pausing to glance at her as she touched the keys. Their curiosity was evident, some whispering questions about her skill, others simply watching quietly. She could feel their attention, and though she did not seek it, it reminded her of the impact her music could have. It was not about impressing people or proving herself. It was about reconnecting with something essential, something that had always been a part of her. Her mind wandered to the idea of opportunity, something she rarely considered. What if someone here could help her rediscover a path she had once dreamed of? What if this brief moment led to something greater, a chance to pursue music again, even in a small way? She pushed the thought aside, reminding herself to stay present. There was time to dream later. For now, she had a job to do, plates to carry, glasses to refill, and a room full of people to serve. Yet even as she moved through the crowd, she could not ignore the lingering sense of change. Something subtle had shifted, not just in the eyes of the guests, but within herself. The courage it had taken to sit at the piano, to play despite uncertainty, had awakened a quiet confidence that she had not felt in years. It was not a loud, boastful confidence, but a steady, enduring one, like a small flame burning quietly in the center of her being. As she worked, she began to notice small details she might have missed before. The way the chandeliers reflected light across the polished floor, the soft murmur of conversation that rose and fell like a tide, the delicate expressions of surprise and admiration on faces that had only moments ago doubted her abilities. Each observation reinforced the idea that she had changed something, even if only for a fleeting moment. She had shifted the perspective of those around her, challenging assumptions and expectations in a subtle but powerful way. A waiter passed by with a tray stacked high with glasses, and she offered a quiet nod in greeting. He smiled, clearly aware of the moment that had unfolded at the piano. "Quite the performance," he said softly, a teasing note in his voice. She allowed herself a small smile, acknowledging the comment without dwelling on it. She was beginning to realize that recognition could be accepted gracefully, without needing to define her entire identity. The night stretched on, and the gala continued with its elegant rhythm. Guests moved from table to table, enjoying food and conversation, while the staff worked tirelessly to ensure everything ran smoothly. Yet there was a subtle undercurrent in the room, a shift in energy that had not been there before. The moment of music, brief as it had left its mark. People talked quietly among themselves, sharing impressions of the young waitress who had surprised them, each retelling adding a layer of admiration and wonder. She found herself drawn back to the piano again, though she did not sit this time. Instead, she leaned lightly against it, letting her fingers brush the keys as she watched the crowd. A few guests glanced at her curiously, some whispering questions, others simply observing. She allowed herself a private smile, acknowledging the connection without needing to perform. It was enough to know that the music had made a difference, even if only for a few minutes. As the evening progressed, the young waitress began to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the years spent balancing work and responsibilities, the sacrifices made to keep life moving forward. She thought of the moments of doubt and the times she had questioned her own abilities. And yet, despite all of that, she had stepped forward, taken a risk, and shared a piece of herself with the world. That act, small though it may have seemed to others, carried immense personal significance. A few guests approached her again, this time with more formal compliments. One elderly woman, clearly impressed, reached out to gently touch her arm. "You have a rare gift," she said softly. "Do not let it go unnoticed." The young waitress nodded, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. She accepted the praise without arrogance, letting it settle within her like a gentle reassurance. In that moment, she realized that her life could hold more than she had allowed herself to imagine. The music had not only captivated the room, it had awakened something within her, a sense of possibility, of potential, of a future that might include more than the routine and the expected. She had touched something essential, both in herself and in others. And the experience was transformative in its subtle, quiet way. The gala began to wind down, with guests gradually leaving, exchanging final pleasantries and farewells. The staff moved efficiently, clearing tables and ensuring that everything was returned to order. The young waitress continued her duties, but there was a lightness in her step, a quiet confidence that had not been present when the evening began. She had stepped into a moment of unexpected opportunity, and though the night was ending, its impact would linger long after as she packed away trays and cleaned up the final dishes. She allowed herself a moment of reflection. The applause, the surprised faces, the whispered compliments, they were not just acknowledgments of talent. They were reminders that life could offer unexpected moments, that courage could lead to recognition, and that even the smallest acts of bravery could have lasting effects. She walked past the piano one last time. The night had grown quieter. Most of the gala had ended, and only a few lingering guests remained, talking in small clusters near the corners of the grand hall. The chandeliers reflected softly on the polished floor, creating long golden reflections that stretched toward the walls. The young waitress, who had spent the evening serving drinks and trays of food, now found herself drawn back to the piano. It sat in the center of the hall, polished and gleaming, bathed in the soft spotlight that had been set for the evening's occasional musical interludes. She approached slowly, her footsteps almost silent against the wooden floor. The piano seemed to call to her, each key reflecting the memory of countless hours she had spent with her fingers pressed against them in the past. She ran her hand lightly over the surface, feeling the smooth coolness under her fingertips, and for a moment, she was transported back to a simpler time, years of practice in a small, sunlit room. The smell of polished wood and old sheet music surrounding her. Her heart beat faster. She knew what she wanted to do. She had tasted the reaction of the crowd earlier, brief though it had been, and it had ignited something inside her. It was not vanity that drove her now, but a quiet need to reconnect with the part of herself she had tucked away, hidden beneath years of routine, hard work, and obligations. Music had always been her sanctuary, her language, the way she expressed what words could not. Tonight, she felt that calling stronger than ever. A few remaining guests noticed her as she approached the piano. Some whispered quietly to each other, their curiosity evident. "She's going back?" one asked, raising an eyebrow. "I wonder if she's going to play again." The other shrugged, eyes wide with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. They had seen her perform briefly earlier, enough to recognize the skill and passion in her playing. But now the possibility of another performance filled them with anticipation. The young waitress took a seat on the bench, adjusting her posture as she had learned long ago. She let her fingers hover above the keys for a moment, feeling the coolness beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to breathe and center her thoughts. The hall was quiet, filled only with the soft murmur of those lingering guests, yet she felt no anxiety. Instead, she felt a calm focus, a readiness to let the music flow through her without hesitation or fear-doubt. As she pressed the first note, the room seemed to hold its breath. The sound was soft, deliberate, and clear, resonating through the polished wood and filling the space with a quiet power. The lingering guests turned to watch, their whispers fading as the first melody began. The young waitress did not play for applause or recognition. She played because it was part of her, because it was a language she had always known, because it had waited patiently for this moment to return. The melody began simply, with gentle chords that seemed to rise and fall like waves. Each note carried intention, each pause a delicate balance between expectation and surprise. She allowed the music to build naturally, her fingers moving with a combination of precision and freedom, guided by years of instinct and memory. The hall, once filled with chatter and casual conversation, now grew quiet, drawn into the rhythm of her playing. Guests who had lingered near the corners of the room gradually moved closer, unable to resist the pull of the music. Their eyes followed her hands as they danced over the keys, noting the subtle shifts in pressure, the grace with which she transitioned between notes, the emotion that seemed to flow from her very being. Some felt a lump in their throats, caught off guard by the unexpected depth of feeling in the performance. Others exchanged silent glances, acknowledging without words that they were witnessing something rare and extraordinary. The young waitress allowed herself to become lost in the music. She did not think about who was watching, what they were thinking, or how they might judge her. She only thought about the melody, the way it rose from silence and carried meaning beyond words. The hall seemed to shrink around her, the guests fading into a quiet haze as she focused entirely on the connection between herself and the piano. Each chord was deliberate, each note imbued with emotion, and each pause a moment of reflection and anticipation. A few of the guests leaned in closer, unable to resist the intensity of the music. Their eyes were fixed on her hands, on the movement of her fingers, on the expression of concentration and passion on her face. Some whispered to each other, trying to describe what they were feeling. "It's incredible," one said softly. "I've never heard anything like this." Another nodded, words failing them. Overwhelmed by the beauty of the performance, the melody grew, evolving into a complex piece that combined technical skill with emotional depth. Her fingers moved with confidence, effortlessly navigating the keys with a fluidity that seemed almost magical. The music told a story of hope, of longing, of quiet determination, and the guests were captivated. They could feel the emotion in each note, the dedication behind every movement, and the authenticity of a person who had lived and breathed music long before the gala had begun. She allowed herself a brief smile as she noticed the reactions around her. The initial surprise of the guests had given way to genuine admiration, a recognition that transcended the usual social pretenses. People who had assumed she was merely a waitress now saw her differently. They saw talent, discipline, and a connection to something larger than the room, the gala, or even themselves. In that moment, she was no longer invisible. She was a force, subtle but undeniable. The music continued, flowing naturally from one theme to another. She incorporated small flourishes, delicate transitions, and moments of quiet reflection, allowing the piece to breathe and evolve. It was not a performance in the sense of seeking approval. It was an expression, a sharing of herself with those willing to listen. The notes filled the hall, wrapping around the guests like a warm, comforting presence, drawing them in and holding them in the moment. As the piece reached its midpoint, the young waitress felt a surge of confidence. She had always known the power of music to communicate, to move people, to transcend language and expectation. Now she was witnessing it firsthand, in a way that was both exhilarating and humbling. The faces of the guests reflected a mixture of awe, respect, and wonder, and she allowed herself to feel the quiet satisfaction of creating something that had touched others so profoundly. Some guests were visibly moved, their eyes glistening with emotion. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to articulate the experience they were witnessing. Even those who had initially doubted her talent could not help but be drawn into the performance, their assumptions shattered by the skill, emotion, and authenticity she displayed. The young waitress played not for approval, but for connection, and the response was overwhelming in its sincerity. As the melody developed, she allowed herself to explore the full range of the piano. Soft, delicate passages gave way to bold, resonant chords, each transition handled with precision and care. She felt the music as much as she played it, each note a conversation, each chord a statement. The hall seemed to exist only for the moment, the guests suspended in a shared experience that transcended social hierarchy, wealth, and expectation. The young waitress's fingers moved effortlessly, guided by memory, instinct, and the quiet confidence that had been growing within her all evening. She incorporated subtle variations, dynamic shifts, and unexpected turns, keeping the audience engaged and invested in the journey she was creating. The performance was a balance of technical skill and emotional resonance, a testament to her years of dedication and the depth of her understanding of music. A few guests exchanged quiet whispers, marveling at the unexpected display of talent. "She's extraordinary," one said. Another nodded, still watching her hands as they moved across the keys. "It's like she was born to do this." The young waitress remained focused, allowing the music to guide her, letting the notes carry her forward without concern for reaction or judgment. The room seemed to grow smaller, more intimate, as the music continued. The sound of the piano filled every corner, wrapping around the guests and drawing them closer to the moment. Conversations had ceased entirely, replaced by the shared experience of listening, feeling, and being moved. Even those who had not paid much attention earlier found themselves captivated, caught up in the flow of melody and emotion that seemed to emanate effortlessly from her fingertips. The young waitress felt a sense of connection with the guests, not in the usual social sense, but in the unspoken language of music. She could sense their surprise, their admiration, their awe, and she allowed it to motivate her without letting it control her. The performance was hers, a personal expression of skill, emotion, and passion. And yet it was also a gift to those willing to truly listen. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, she began to slow the tempo, allowing each note to resonate fully, giving space for reflection and appreciation. The guests were silent, fully immersed in the final moments, their attention unwavering. She felt the culmination of the evening's events, the connection she had created, and the quiet triumph of stepping beyond expectation. Finally, with a delicate, lingering chord, she ended the piece. The sound hung in the air, fading naturally into the quiet of the hall. For a moment, there was complete silence, as if the room itself were hall. The applause had barely faded when the young waitress, still seated at the piano, felt a gentle but undeniable shift in the room. The remaining guests, who had been quiet and uncertain, were now fully attentive. The hall seemed to have changed its rhythm. Conversations had ceased entirely, replaced by a soft, collective anticipation. She could feel their eyes on her, not with judgment or skepticism this time, but with curiosity and admiration. It was as if the entire space were waiting for her to speak through the music once more, to let them see the depth that a simple uniform could never reveal. Her hands hovered above the keys, almost instinctively, and she felt the familiar spark of excitement, a mixture of nervousness and joy that had accompanied her every performance since childhood. She had never played for this kind of audience before. These were people who were used to refinement, to polished talent, to the very best of everything life could offer. And yet, here she was, a waitress, stepping into their world with nothing but her memory, her skill, and the music that had been waiting inside her for years. She started again, this time more slowly, letting a soft melody flow from her fingers. It was delicate at first, like the gentle ripple of water, easing the room into her presence. The notes were precise, carefully measured, each one placed with intention. She did not need to rush. She had the attention of every person still present, and she felt an unfamiliar kind of freedom in that knowledge dot as the melody grew. It transformed from something gentle and contemplative into a richer, more complex arrangement. She added subtle flourishes, small bursts of speed, intricate sequences that tested her own memory and skill. The audience responded in kind, leaning forward, eyes wide, as if they were seeing something impossible unfold before them. There was no conversation, no distraction, just the quiet, intense connection between performer and listener. The young waitress felt herself becoming more immersed in the music, letting it guide her fingers and her emotions. She played not only with technique, but with feeling, allowing every chord and every note to carry the story she wanted to tell. It was a story of resilience, of quiet confidence, of the hidden talents that often go unnoticed until the right moment arrives. With each key she pressed, she felt a release, a freedom that had been missing from her life for too long. The room responded almost instantly. Those who had doubted her earlier were now visibly moved. Some guests clasped their hands together, eyes closed, letting the music fill them completely. Others sat frozen, mouths slightly open in awe, trying to absorb the skill and emotion they were witnessing. A few even reached for each other, sharing a quiet acknowledgement of the unexpected brilliance before them. Every person present seemed to be experiencing the performance in their own personal way, yet all were united by a shared sense of wonder. She shifted the melody slightly, moving into a more dramatic section. Her hands danced across the keys, precise yet fluid, balancing technical complexity with emotional resonance. The music grew louder, fuller, richer, resonating through the hall and filling every corner. The acoustics amplified not just the sound, but the feeling, the energy of the performance, the authenticity of someone speaking their truth through the piano. The young waitress could sense the impact. Even those who had initially smiled or chuckled when she first approached the piano were now silent, fully engaged, eyes fixed on her every movement. She was no longer a server, a background presence, or an amusement for the evening's elite. She had become the center of attention, a storyteller through music, and a reminder that talent and passion can appear in the most unexpected places. She allowed the melody to slow for a brief moment, letting the resonance hang in the air. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was reverent. Guests sat motionless, absorbing the final notes, letting them settle within their minds and hearts. The young waitress felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had not only impressed, but had moved these people in a way that went beyond social expectation or polite applause. Then she introduced a new theme, one that was bold and confident. The music surged forward, carrying energy and emotion that demanded attention. She played with power, precision, and a subtle grace that made the notes sing in a way that was almost alive. The audience leaned forward instinctively, drawn into the intensity of the performance, unable to look away. Each chord seemed to speak directly to them, telling a story that transcended words, status, and expectation. She noticed a few reactions that made her heart lift. A woman near the front wiped a tear from her eye, unable to hide the emotion stirred by the unexpected beauty of the performance. A man in a suit, usually reserved and composed, sat with his jaw slightly dropped, clearly struggling to reconcile what he had assumed about her with the reality of the music. Even those who were known for their critical eyes and refined tastes seemed spellbound, their skepticism replaced by genuine admiration. The young waitress continued, allowing the music to ebb and flow naturally. She alternated between soft, delicate passages that invited introspection and louder, more dramatic sections that demanded attention. Each transition was seamless, reflecting not only her technical skill, but her deep understanding of musical storytelling. She had learned early on that music was not just about playing notes. It was about conveying emotion, telling a story, and creating a connection with those who were willing to listen. The audience was completely absorbed. They leaned closer, their collective focus creating an almost tangible energy in the hall. The piano, once a decorative fixture in the center of the room, had become a vessel of emotion, a conduit for something far greater than mere entertainment. Every chord, every arpeggio, every carefully crafted pause resonated through the space, touching hearts in ways that were difficult to articulate. The young waitress allowed herself to become fully present in the music. Her mind was clear, her emotions aligned with each note, and her fingers moved with confidence and grace. The complexity of the piece, combined with its emotional depth, drew audible gasps and whispered reactions from the guests. Some leaned into each other, exchanging astonished looks, while others simply sat in silence, overwhelmed by the unexpected brilliance of the performance. She had moved beyond nerves entirely. The earlier hesitation, the fear of failure, and the doubt she had felt before stepping up to the piano had been replaced by a quiet certainty. This was where she belonged, if only for a moment, and she allowed herself to embrace it fully. The music became a reflection of her inner strength, her resilience, and the years she had spent quietly honing her craft. Every note was a declaration that she was more than appearances, more than circumstance, and capable of extraordinary things. The melody evolved again, growing richer and more intricate. Her fingers danced across the keys with precision, yet there was a fluidity that made it appear effortless. The audience remained captivated, some visibly moved to tears, others leaning forward with rapt attention. The room had transformed from a space of casual socializing into a shared experience of awe, respect, and admiration. For those few minutes, there was no hierarchy, no social status only. The music and the connection it created. The young waitress noticed a few particularly stunned expressions. A man who had earlier doubted her skill now watched with unguarded awe, his initial smirk replaced by wide-eyed admiration. A woman who had whispered skeptically to her friend moments before was now leaning forward, completely absorbed, as if the music had erased all preconceived notions. Each reaction, subtle though it may have been, reinforced the realization that her performance was having a profound impact. She allowed herself a brief pause in the melody, letting the silence hang in the room. The effect was immediate. The guests seemed to hold their collective breath, waiting for the next note. She smiled faintly, recognizing the power of anticipation and the effect it had on the audience. Then, with a gentle but deliberate press of her fingers, she resumed, weaving together technical brilliance and emotional depth in a way that made each moment feel alive. Urgent and meaningful by now, the hall was completely transformed. What had begun as polite curiosity had evolved into genuine captivation. Every guest, no matter how skeptical or reserved, was caught up in the spell of the music. The young waitress could feel it, the quiet, collective energy that connected performer and audience, a shared understanding that something remarkable was unfolding before them. It was a moment of true human connection, facilitated entirely through her skill and the language of music. She continued to play, exploring the full range of the piano in her own ability. Soft, lyrical passages flowed seamlessly into powerful, resonant chords. She added subtle embellishments, delicate trills, and unexpected harmonic shifts that kept the audience engaged and enthralled. Her fingers moved with a confidence born of years of practice, yet the performance felt spontaneous, alive, and deeply personal. The guests were spellbound. Some were visibly emotional, unable to contain their response. Others leaned forward, captivated by the skill and emotion displayed before them. Even those who were normally reserved or critical could not help but be drawn into the performance. The music transcended social barriers, status, and expectation, creating a shared experience that was powerful, intimate, and unforgettable. As the piece moved T. The applause continued to echo through the hall, long after the final note had faded. The young waitress stood beside the piano, her hands still slightly trembling, a mixture of relief, pride, and exhilaration running through her. She felt a strange sense of disbelief, as if she had stepped into a dream that was only now becoming real. The people around her, the guests, the elite crowd who had initially doubted her, were no longer distant observers. They were witnesses, fully present, caught in the undeniable power of what she had just shared. As the first waves of clapping began to die down, she noticed subtle shifts in the way people were looking at her. Some faces were glowing with admiration, others held expressions of astonishment, and a few were clearly trying to compose themselves, struggling to reconcile the image of a simple waitress with the extraordinary talent they had just witnessed. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply take it in, the transformation of perception, the breaking of assumptions, the acknowledgement of something that had been invisible until now. Several guests approached her cautiously, unsure how to bridge the gap between the performance and the social norms of the evening. I didn't expect that," one man said softly, extending his hand in respect. His eyes reflected genuine surprise, tinged with the hint of embarrassment that came from having underestimated her. "You have a remarkable gift. Truly remarkable." She smiled politely, nodding, letting the words settle without becoming the center of her identity. She knew this moment was about more than compliments. It was about recognition, about connection, about breaking through invisible barriers. A few women lingered nearby, whispering among themselves. "I can't believe it," one murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought she was just a server. I never imagined this." Her companion nodded, eyes wide, unable to find the right words to express the awe she felt. The young waitress felt a quiet warmth in her chest. These were people who had dismissed her presence, who had assumed that her role in the room was limited to serving food and drinks, and yet here they were, caught in the reality of her talent. Even the man who had jokingly asked her to play earlier seemed changed. His initial smirk had vanished, replaced by a careful, almost cautious respect. He approached her, his posture slightly different than before. "I may have underestimated you," he admitted quietly, his voice stripped of arrogance. "That was more than I expected." She nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without resentment or pride. She had already proven herself in the moment of performance. The validation of others, while welcome, was secondary to the fulfillment she felt within. A few of the remaining guests were seated closer to the piano now, still captivated by her presence. Their reactions were varied but sincere. One older woman reached out, gently touching her arm. "You must never hide this talent," she whispered. "The world needs to hear it." Another man, who had initially appeared reserved and critical, simply stood silently, his eyes fixed on her, reflecting astonishment and deep admiration. The young waitress absorbed it all quietly, letting it wash over her like a gentle wave. She did not need to respond immediately. The recognition, the shift in perception, was enough. The hall itself seemed to have changed. The quiet murmur of conversation that had once filled the space was replaced by a lingering energy, a shared acknowledgement of something extraordinary. Even those who had initially been skeptical or indifferent were now part of the moment, their attention and respect captured by the raw authenticity of the performance. The young waitress could feel the impact, a ripple of admiration and connection that extended beyond the immediate audience. Touching everyone who had been present, as she returned to her duties, carefully balancing trays and glasses, she noticed the subtle ways in which the staff and guests treated her differently. A few people held doors open longer, offering polite smiles that carried a hint of newfound respect. Others whispered quietly, sharing impressions of her performance, their voices tinged with genuine admiration. Even the casual nods of acknowledgement, small as they were, reinforced the realization that something had shifted, not just in the eyes of the guests, but in the perception of herself. She moved among the tables, observing faces still lit with the memory of the music. Some guests were talking quietly to each other, recounting specific moments, specific notes, gestures, or expressions that had moved them. Others were simply sitting, lost in their thoughts, replaying the performance in their minds. The young waitress felt a quiet pride, not in the sense of vanity, but in the understanding that she had connected with people in a meaningful way, that her music had transcended social expectation and reached something deeper. Few of the remaining guests approached her again, this time with more intentionality. One man, clearly well-versed in music, lingered near the piano, observing her carefully. "You have a rare gift," he said softly. "I would encourage you to continue. Have you considered performing more formally?" His words were not a request but an offer, a recognition that her talent deserved to be shared beyond the walls of this gala. She nodded, feeling a mixture of humility and possibility. She had never expected this evening to lead anywhere beyond the brief moment of applause. Yet now she could imagine a path opening before her. A woman with sharp, discerning eyes added, "What you did tonight was extraordinary. Not just skill, but the emotion, the connection. Very few people can do that." The young waitress felt a small smile tug at her lips. It was rare to hear such acknowledgement, unclouded by social pretense or expectation. The appreciation was sincere, grounded in the shared human experience of being moved by something beautiful, unexpected and authentic. The energy in the hall continued to shift. Even as the final guests prepared to leave, they lingered, reluctant to fully break the spell of the evening. The music, though no longer sounding, left a presence in the room, a reminder that moments of genuine connection and inspiration could arise from the most unexpected sources. The young waitress noticed the lingering glances, the subtle smiles, the quiet gestures of admiration. It was clear that her performance had created a lasting impression. For a few minutes, she stood near the piano, allowing herself to reflect. The room had been transformed, not physically, but in perception. The elite crowd who had doubted her had been confronted with undeniable talent and authenticity. The applause, the whispered compliments, the respectful gazes, all in it, had a profound effect, both outwardly in the reactions of others and inwardly in the affirmation she felt within herself. She had stepped beyond expectation, and in doing so, had changed the dynamic of the evening entirely. She felt a subtle thrill, a sense of possibility that had been absent for years. The recognition was not about fame or wealth. It was about acknowledgement, connection, and the realization that she could claim space in a world that often overlooked her. It was a reminder that talent, dedication, and courage could not be hidden forever, and that even a single moment of bravery could alter perception in ways unimaginable. The few remaining staff members moved quietly around her, clearing tables and arranging chairs. One of them approached her, offering a small, knowing smile. "I saw that," they said softly. "You were amazing." She nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement from someone who had worked alongside her, who understood both the effort and the risk it had taken to step forward in that moment. There was a quiet camaraderie in the recognition, a shared understanding of the courage required to embrace such a moment. As she finished her duties and prepared to leave the hall, she allowed herself to take one final glance at the piano. The polished keys gleamed in the soft lighting, a silent witness to the transformation that had occurred. She could still feel the echoes of her music in the space, the lingering presence of the melodies she had created, and the impact it had on those who had heard it. For a few moments, she simply stood there, letting it sink in, savoring the sense of fulfillment and possibility that the evening had given her. The experience had changed her, in subtle but profound ways. She had discovered that her talent, long hidden, could command attention, evoke emotion, and create connection. She had learned that stepping forward, even in the face of doubt and expectation, could result in moments of transformation, not just for herself, but for those around her. The evening had revealed the power of authenticity, the value of courage, and the unexpected joy that could arise from embracing opportunity when it presented itself. Even as the lights dimmed and the last guests departed, she could feel the resonance of the evening within her, the memory of the performance, the reaction of the audience, and the quiet acknowledgement of her abilities remained vivid, a reminder of what was possible when one embraced their true self. She knew that this moment would stay with her forever, a turning point in both perception and personal growth. Walking out into the cool night air, she felt a quiet strength she had not known before. The applause, the astonished faces, the words of encouragement, they were all part of a larger realization that she could achieve more than she had allowed herself to imagine, that her talent and her courage were enough to create meaningful moments, and that the world could respond to authenticity with admiration and respect. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream beyond the boundaries she had. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, spilling across the small apartment where the young waitress had returned after the gala. She sat quietly at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand, though she barely tasted it. Her mind was still wrapped in the events of the previous night, replaying every note, every glance, every subtle shift in the room, as her music had captured attention and admiration. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as a server, not as someone ordinary, but as someone capable of extraordinary things. She allowed herself to remember the way the guests had reacted, the astonishment in their eyes, the quiet murmur of praise, the standing ovation at the end. It had been more than just applause. It had been acknowledgement of her talent, her courage, and her authenticity. And in that acknowledgement, she had discovered a new sense of possibility, one that extended far beyond the walls of the gala hall. The day unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if she were savoring the calm after the intensity of the previous evening. She moved through her routine with a quiet grace, noting small details that she had previously overlooked: the sound of birds outside, the sunlight on the warm wooden floor, the gentle warmth of the tea she held. Everything felt subtly transformed, infused with the lingering energy of the night before. It was a reminder that moments of courage and authenticity could ripple outward, touching life in ways both expected and unforeseen. Even as she busied herself with chores, her mind kept drifting back to the piano. She imagined the feel of the keys beneath her fingers, the resonance of the notes in the hall, and the way the music had drawn people in. She could still see the faces of the guests, their expressions a mixture of astonishment, respect, and admiration. She had given them a gift that could not be measured in applause or compliments alone. It was the gift of connection, of shared experience, of something deeply human and undeniable, A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She set the cup down and moved to answer it, curious and slightly hesitant. Standing there was one of the gala organizers, holding an envelope with a polite, expectant smile. "Good morning," he said softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to deliver this personally." She accepted the envelope, her fingers brushing his in a brief, human connection that carried no pretense, only courtesy. Inside the envelope was a note, elegantly written, expressing appreciation for her performance and extending an invitation. The message was simple yet profound. It recognized her talent, acknowledged the impact she had made, and offered her an opportunity to perform at a formal concert for a broader audience. She read it once, twice, and then allowed herself to breathe, the words settling like a warm weight in her chest. This was more than recognition. It was a door opening, a chance to step further into the world she had only dared to touch for a single evening. She sat back, letting the magnitude of the opportunity sink in. For a long moment, she allowed herself to simply feel the excitement, the apprehension, the quiet thrill of possibility. She knew this was a turning point, a moment that could shape the trajectory of her life. And yet, she also knew that the choice was hers to make. She could accept the invitation and pursue this path, or she could retreat into the comfort and familiarity of her routine. After a few moments of reflection, she set the envelope aside and moved to the piano in the corner of her small apartment. The instrument was modest, but it had been her companion through countless hours of practice, the keeper of her dreams and the witness to her persistence. She pressed a key softly, letting the note resonate, and for a moment it felt as though the room itself were listening. She allowed her fingers to move freely, testing melodies, improvising, and exploring the possibilities. Each note carried not just sound but intention, a reflection of her renewed confidence and the journey that had led her to this moment. Time seemed to stretch as she played, the music flowing naturally from her memory and imagination. She experimented with different themes, explored subtle variations, and allowed the melody to shift organically. There was no pressure, no expectation, only the pure, unadulterated joy of creating something that was wholly her own. And as she played, she felt a deep sense of connection, not just to the music, but to the person she was becoming. The experience of the gala, the recognition, the validation, it all converged in this simple act of creation, reinforcing the truth she had always known, that her talent was real, meaningful, and capable of touching others. Later that day, she began to prepare for the upcoming concert. She made a list of pieces she wanted to perform, carefully considering both technical difficulty and emotional impact. She revisited old sheet music, dusting off familiar favorites, and experimented with new compositions that had only existed in her mind. The process was meticulous, deliberate, and deeply satisfying. She understood that this opportunity required dedication, preparation, and focus, and she was determined to rise to the challenge. Her daily routine began to change subtly. Time that had once been occupied with chores, errands, and mundane responsibilities was now balanced with practice, reflection, and planning. She approached each task with renewed energy, finding that the spark ignited by the gala had not dimmed. The anticipation of performing for a broader audience fueled her efforts, yet she remained grounded, focused on the quality and authenticity of her music, rather than the potential accolades in the days that followed. Word of her performance at the gala spread. Friends and acquaintances who had attended the event shared stories of her talent, each retelling adding a layer of admiration and intrigue. Some strangers reached out, expressing curiosity, offering encouragement, or simply wanting to witness her skill firsthand. The attention was unexpected, yet she met it with the same quiet grace that had carried her through the gala itself. She did not seek fame or recognition, only the opportunity to continue doing what she loved. and to share it with those who would appreciate it. The young waitress also began to notice subtle changes in her own perception. The confidence that had been sparked during the performance had taken root, growing steadily with each passing day. She moved through her routine with a sense of purpose, noticing small opportunities, engaging more fully with her surroundings, and embracing the idea that she could shape her own path. The experience had taught her that talent alone was not enough. It required courage, authenticity, and the willingness to step into the light, even when it was uncomfortable. As the date of the concert approached, she dedicated herself fully to preparation. She practiced tirelessly, refining her technique, exploring nuances of expression, and experimenting with dynamics to ensure that every note carried meaning. Each day brought a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation, yet she welcomed both, understanding that they were natural companions on the path of growth and achievement. The night of the concert arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation. The venue was elegant, the audience diverse, and the atmosphere charged with expectation. She arrived early, familiarizing herself with the piano, the acoustics, and the space she would inhabit during the performance. There was no need for fear. She felt prepared, grounded, and ready to share her music with an audience that had come to listen, to feel, and to be moved. When it was time to begin, she took a deep breath and seated herself at the piano. The audience fell silent as she pressed the first key, the sound resonating through the hall with clarity and intention. Each note was deliberate, expressive, and infused with the emotion that had fueled her journey. She allowed herself to become fully immersed, her fingers moving with confidence and grace, the music flowing naturally from her memory, her practice, and her heart. The audience was captivated from the very first note. They leaned forward, eyes fixed on her hands, on the subtle expressions of concentration and passion that played across her face. They were not simply observing a performance. They were experiencing a connection, a shared moment of emotion, an understanding that transcended words. The young waitress played not for recognition, not for applause, but for the joy of creation and the power of music to communicate what words often could not. As the performance progressed, she explored the full range of the piano, from soft, delicate passages that invited reflection to powerful, resonant chords that commanded attention. Each transition was seamless, each note imbued with intention, and each pause allowed the audience to absorb the depth of emotion being conveyed. She was fully present, fully alive in the music, and fully aware of the profound impact it had on those listening. The audience responded with enthusiasm, their applause growing with each section of the performance. Some were visibly moved to tears, others leaned closer, captivated by the skill and emotion displayed. Every reaction reinforced the truth she had discovered months earlier, that courage, authenticity, and talent could create moments of profound connection, transcending social barriers, assumptions, and expectation. By the end of the concert, the hall was filled with standing applause. The young waitress rose from the piano bench, a quiet smile on her face, hands still trembling from the intensity of the performance. She took a deep bow, acknowledging the audience, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment, pride, and connection. This was more than a single moment of recognition. It was the culmination,